All right, one thing on last week, when I gave you the verses that have Day of the Lord or referring to Jesus' return, I left out Daniel 13:11. Daniel 13:11. If you go to Daniel 13:11, it talks about the return of Jesus. And in that period of time, it gives us 3 periods of time. It gives us the, and we have 3 periods of tribulation if you go to Revelation. The first 3.5 years, you have the seals. The second 3.5 years, you have the trumpets. And then if you go to Daniel, it says there's 3.5 years, and yet 1,290 days, which is another 45 days. So your 3 periods in Daniel are 3.5, and 45. So the first seals are a time of warning, trying to get people to turn and repent and get serious about the condition that you're in. Second 3.5 years is a warning times 2. If you look at the first 3.5, if you look at the seals, about the same thing happens when the trumpets blow, but it's more intense. It's twice as intense. Okay. And then you come to the wrath, and that's going to last for 45 days according to Daniel. So I somehow skipped over that last week. Let's get that in there. John, you look like you have a question.
Oh yeah, I was thinking when he says the day of the Lord, does that mean the beginning of that first 3.5 years?
No, the day of the Lord
is
at the end of the trumpet.
Okay, am I wrong? Okay, there is no 13 in Daniel.
I'm sorry, what?
There's no 13 chapters in Daniel. It's 12. You have 13:11. There's 12 chapters in Daniel.
Did I give you the room? Let me check.
Okay. I was like, am I missing a chapter in my book or what?
No.
Okay.
No, not you.
Yeah. Old fingers. Don't type with those young fingers. And old thumbs don't type at all. Let me see here.
Is it 11:13 instead of 13:11? No.
It's 3:11 maybe?
13. 12:11.
12:11. Okay.
From that time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up. That's talking about the beast, the Antichrist, is set up. There will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits and reaches the end of the 1335. So you see there's 1,290. But the abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist goes into the temple, Holy of Holies, and sacrifices something unholy unto God. Everybody speculates it'll probably be a pig, because some Persian emperor did that to when he conquered Israel, when they were taken away and exiled to Babylon, and they speculate that it'll probably be a similar type sacrifice. So, and that happens in the middle, between the 3.5 and the 3.5. And then it says, and then there'll be, after the desolation, there'll be 1,290 days, which will get us to the end of the 7 years. And then it gives us this third day. It said, and yet 1,335 days, which is another 45 days. Okay? That makes sense? Okay. All right. Sorry about that 13 page.
All right, we found it.
All those numbers are right up there together. You And my fingers are getting fat. So, anyway. Number 5. First, chapter number 5. Somebody read. Today's the week one. Somebody read, we've done 1 through 4, so somebody read 5 and 6.
Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down the wall. I will break down its walls, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it.
Okay, all right. So, what is going to be removed? God's looking at Israel and he's saying, okay, I'm sick of you, I'm tired of you, you're a stiff-necked, stubborn bunch of people. I have dealt with you, dealt with you, dealt with you, so I am going to, and this is talking about the final exile that started in AD 70. Okay, this is their final, it's final motion. He said, I'm done with it. You're gonna be spread out through all of the nations, and you are going to, and then he talks about what he's going to do to the vineyard. And remember, the vineyard is Israel. That parable about the vineyard, it's Israel. If you weren't here last week, he talked about, hey Jerry. He talked about the vineyard, he talked about the singer, and he did that whole parable to Isaiah was giving them a parable that they could relate to. A person who owned a vineyard, and he did everything he could to make that vineyard grow. And if you look at what Don just read, he put a hedge around it, he put a wall around it. It was fertile, and it had plenty of rain. And so, what does he say to Israel? And he's not talking about a grape harbor, he's talking about the nation of Israel. He said, here's what you've earned, and here's what you're going to get. I'm going to take down the hedge. Why did it have a hedge around it?
Protection.
To protect it?
From what? You're right, but from what?
Its enemies? Its enemies?
Its enemies. Enemies.
Enemies.
From another army. Bad guys, that's it, bad guys.
Okay, hold that one. You're going to need it next. They can put up the hedge for the animals, keep the animals out, keep the cattle from running across it. We did similar things in southern Ohio and also here in Indiana. That's how we got multi-floor roads. Originally, when they settled the place, they didn't have the wherewithal to build fences the way they should to keep the animals out. So they built multi-floor roads, and if you've got any multi-floor roads on your place, it just runs like crazy. It fills in the gaps, so they put these rose bushes in. After 2 or 3 years, they had this multi-floor rose bush, and then they could put animals in it, and the animals wouldn't get through the roads. And in southern Ohio, that's how they got a lot of the crab apples. And then they put rose bushes in between the crab apples. We had crab apples in southern Ohio like you guys have cedar trees. Crab apples everywhere, and the deer loved them. We also made crab apple jelly. About a pint of crab apples and about 10 tons of sugar and crab apple jelly. So that's where we got the multi-floor rows from. It was a natural way to keep your animals herded up until you could get your plot of land cleared. You can get your crops. You had to do everything all at once. Couldn't just move in and build a house because you had to eat. You also had to have a garden and you had to have your crops. And your animals had to have grain to eat, and I mean, you had to do everything all at once, all the time. And so you couldn't just take off a month and build a fence. So they planted rose bushes to keep the animals herded up. And eventually, they got around to building the fence. Okay, the wall.
Enemies.
Yeah, the chariots could run over the hedges. The chariots could just run right through the crab apples and the multiflora roses and the hedges that they built, but couldn't run through the wall. So the wall was for the enemies, to keep the enemies out, to keep the thieves out, the burglars who would come at night, steal the crops, or burn your crops down if it happened to be an invading army. First thing they did was destroy the food supply, and the army marches on its stomach, and if there's nothing to put in the soldier's stomach, the war's short. We did the same thing in the South when they went through Georgia in the Civil War. They burnt all the grain fields. They burned, and basically they starved the army out. Kind of cruel and inhumane, but that's the way they did it. And that's the way it worked. Okay, fertility. Remember, if you remember back at the parable, he said, I did everything I could. I fertilized the land. I manured the soil. I planted the best crops that I could find, the best seedlings, the best grapevines planted from seeds or planted from rootstock. I picked the best that I had, and all I got was bad fruit. All I've gotten from the very beginning was bad fruit. And I'm tired of it. Not going to mess with it anymore. So it was fertile. And finally there was the rain. And so what did he say he's going to take away? Going to take away the hedge, take away the wall, going to take away the fertility, and going to take away the rain. And remember I told you a couple of weeks ago, when they surveyed Israel, there was a war between the local nations, the Arab nations, and the nations up in the Ukraine and Russian area back in the 1800s. There was this big war. And at the end, there was a lot of debt. The Arab nations didn't have any oil wells at that point. And so they owed everybody a ton of money. And so they started selling the land that used to be Israel. And surveyors went in to survey the land so that they could sell the sections of it. And in 1867, they started to sell the land. Well, the Israelites were not allowed to buy the land. So the Israelites paid other people to buy the land for them. And they would go in, Americans of different kinds, and also in Europe, Europeans would go in and they'd buy a section of land. Well, the guy that went in to survey the land and to set up the sections so that the Arab leader who was in charge of that area could get some money to pay off some of his debts. He said it was a totally desolate place. The remains of Jerusalem were still there, but Arabs would stop there as they were traveled around, as they migrated around, and spend a week there or 10 days and get enough water and get their animals fed and stocked up with water, and then they'd move on. It was total desolation for 2,000 years. When God said this, he meant he was going to do it until the last days, the final generation of mankind. Because it also says in Matthew 24 that the generation that sees Israel return home will be the generation that sees the return of Jesus Christ. I was born in 1946, they returned home in 1947. So if I live to be a full generation person, I'll see it. I think I'm already seeing it. If you don't want to hear about it, don't watch the news, because prophecy's on the news every day. And you guys have been taught Revelation and some other prophecies, and you can You'll recognize it. It's all happening right, the peace treaty, the whole thing, it's all happening right before our. 9 Arab nations have now signed the peace treaty. And the whole thing's moving along quickly. Okay, somebody read verse 7. Now from 7 into 30, most commentators say that this is a pattern for a corrupt society. This is how a society becomes corrupt. From 7 to 30 is, if you want to look around and see if your society is healthy or it's becoming corrupt, you want to look at this pattern and see if you see it. It'll be interesting if you see it. Or maybe we're okay, right? Verse 7, the problem. Okay, what's the problem in verse 7? Anybody? Quickly.
The nation of Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of heaven's armies. The people of Judah are his pleasant garden. He expected a crop of justice, but instead he found oppression. He expected to find righteousness, but instead he heard cries of violence.
Okay, what was lacking?
Righteousness.
Justice. Justice was lacking. For he looked for justice, but found bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard the cries of distress. Hold that answer, it's going to be coming up real quick. Okay. Justice was gone. There was no justice. If you go to other places in the Bible, it talked about how the widows were treated. It talked about how the orphans were treated. How they virtually made slaves out of them so that they could live luxurious lives. So that they wouldn't have to feed them with no return. They said, yeah, you can live in the building out back, and you can wash my feet when I come in from the field, and I'll give you the scraps left over from the table. There was no welfare, and there was no Social Security, and they had to take what they could get, and they took advantage of them on every turn of the road. So justice was a problem. How do we stand with respect to justice in the United States today? If you were accused of something today, how do you feel about going to court tomorrow?
Depends on how good of a lawyer you can afford.
Yeah.
Depends on what?
It depends on how good of a lawyer you can afford.
Yeah, and the key word is afford.
You're probably not going to go to court tomorrow. You're going to be incarcerated for 3 to 6 months and then go to court.
Yeah.
You're locked up before you ever have a chance to
Yep.
see a trial.
Sure. And how do you present your case? How do you, if somebody steals something from you, if you have a case against the federal government, you need to first put down a $100,000 retainer. It will cost that in order to get it in front of a judge or a magistrate. Who has $100,000? Okay. And what about that thing, you're innocent until proven guilty?
What?
It's the other way around.
Kind of flip-flopped, haven't it? Okay, that's enough dark stuff. Okay, and the problem is, no, we're going to pick this righteousness thing up later. And he looked for blood for righteousness, but he heard the cries of distress. Okay, hang on to that answer. We're coming back to it. Okay, so verse 8. What was it seated by? Woe to you who add house to house and field to field, till no space is left, till you live alone in the land. What's going on there?
Is it greed?
House to house, field to field. What's it talking
Greed? Is it greed, because somebody's buying up everything?
I mean, they're, I don't know, you ever watch Gunsmoke on TV?
Not as much as you do. Not as much as you do.
Good show. Good show. Gunsmoke's a good show. Last week, during the blizzard and the snow thing and everything, I was reading a book, and I finished those books again
Okay, good.
a long time ago.
Okay.
I just forgot to take it. Matter of fact, read one of them twice. Okay, so I'm reading a book, and Gunsmoke comes on, and it's about some rancher who's taken advantage of this widow, and Matt had been shot at and got grazed in the head, and he had amnesia, and the widow had taken him in and was cared for him. And so he finds out that this rancher is, he wanted her land because her land had the waterhead, the beginning of the creek, the headwaters for this creek that became a stream, that became a river. And she wasn't doing anything to restrict the water flow. He was living on the river. She just had the creek, okay, and the headwater. But he wanted her land so he could have the headwater and he could control the whole river. And she just had this little 40, 80 acre piece of land, and he was trying to take it from her. And you see that every once in a while if you watch westerns on TV. There's always some big guy wanting to rent out all the little homesteaders, and they get their land so he can have it all. And in the end, he's the only guy around. He's pushed everybody else away, and he owns it all. Greed. It's exactly what it is. It's greed. And there's no way to paint it white. It's just greedy people trying to get more than they got. I mean, how much land do I need to live my life?
Let you know when I get there.
All I can get. I didn't say one. I didn't say how much land do I want. How much land do I really need? You know, I've got an 80 by 80 acre garden that cans about 400 or 500 cans of stuff every year and feeds a church. How much do I need? I got 6 acres. Do I need more? I mean, it gives me firewood, it gives me squirrels, and sometimes they're in your gravy, and I don't tell you. I was tempted this week. I caught a young coon in a live trap. I thought, I wonder if they like coon gravy. But barbecue, I didn't do it.
Have we ever turned down gravy?
What?
Have we ever turned down gravy?
But every once in a while you have squirrel gravy. And I never take any home, so you must like squirrel. You just don't know it.
I was gonna say, you're talking the wrong bunch here. We all like squirrel.
Well, pardon me?
I said, you're talking to the wrong bunch. We all like squirrel. You don't have to worry about that.
Well, there's probably a couple that don't. But one of them's not coming anymore, so we don't need to worry about her. But you know, how much do I need? I got a spring. I've never had city water for 35 years. That spring has never gone dry. I've never been 10 minutes without water. I mean, how much do I need? And then how much do I want? And when greed starts mixing its way in, I start finding good excuses to take advantage of you. Greed leads to sin. Greed is sin. Greed, what's the commandment that leads to greed? Covet. We start to covet what somebody else has got. We start to covet their property, we start to cover their possessions, we start to covet their wives or their husbands, and then it all leads to sin. Greed is, and greed is linked to that famous verse, the love of money is the root of all evil. You can start linking the 10 Commandments to money. very easily by looking at covetousness and other things. All right, so it's seeded by greed. You realize the Indians had no concept of land ownership. Neither did the natives in the jungle. They didn't have boundaries or fences. They all lived in a village, and they all went out and hunted monkeys and fished in the river and came back, and the whole village ate. There was no concept of that. You remember Crocodile Dundee, too? Did you see that movie?
Yes.
Remember that Aborigine saying that he came up with about midway through they're traveling across the outback, and she asked him something about his land, and he said, "Oh, we've been on my land for 2 days." Remember that?
Yeah.
He said, "And you own all this?" And he laughed, and he said, "Well," he said, "there's an old Aborigine saying, if you think you own any of the land, it's like two fleas on a dog arguing who owns the dog." You know, we're kind of proud of our houses, we're kind of proud of our property, we're kind of proud of our yard, we're kind of proud of our new barn. But 50 years from now, who's going to be living in it? I got into it with a guy at a church one time. He said, "Well, I paid off my property to you, and it's mine." And I said, "Well, you pay property taxes, don't you?" "Yeah, so?" I said, "Well, it's yours and the government's, because if you don't pay your taxes, who do you think is going to be living in it next year? Whoever they auction it off to." "Well, yeah, but," I said, no. I said, 50 years from now, meet me in your front yard. And he was about 75 years old at the time. He said, 50 years from now, meet me in your front yard, and let's see who's living in it. End of debate. It all stopped right there. Because, you know, it's just leased to us by God for 75, 80 years, and then somebody else picks it. Yeah, I bought it. I mowed the lawn. I remodeled the house. And then I died. Somebody else took it. That's the way it works. All right, verses 9 through 15.
The Lord Almighty has declared in my hearing, surely the great houses will become desolate, the fine mansions left without occupants. A 10-acre vineyard will produce only a bath of wine. A homer of seed will yield only an ephah of grain. Woe to those who rise early in the morning to run after their drinks, who stay up late till they are inflamed with wine. They have harps and lyres at their banquets, pipes and timbrels and wine, but they have no regard for the deeds of the Lord, no respect for the work of his hand. Therefore my people will go into exile for lack of understanding. Those of high rank will die of hunger, and the common people will be parched with thirst. Therefore death expands its jaws, opening wide its mouth. Into it will descend their nobles and masses, with all their brawlers and revelers. So people will be brought low, and everyone humbled, the eyes of the arrogant humbled.
All right, what's the remedy? The lecture, the greed caused them to envy luxuries. So what's the remedy?
Everyone being humbled.
Yep, by taking away the luxuries. God says, "I'll humble you." And for 2,000 years, the Jewish nation pretty much lived in foreign countries, and in the end, they were persecuted by foreign entities, namely the Nazis in World War II. And that brought the sympathy of the world back to Israel. God used that. God didn't ordain it, but he didn't want it either. They chose to be unrighteous. They chose to be greedy. They chose to allow that stumbling block to trip them up. And God tried everything he possibly could to bring them back to righteousness, and they would not come. So finally he said, "I'm going to take it all away from you." I've seen it in my life to a limited extent. It seems like when all things are going good and I'm good with God and reading my Bible and going to church and doing what he wants me to do, it seems things go a whole lot better than when I'm in rebellion and things start falling apart. Now, do you relate to that or not? Can you look back on times that were rough, and was that a time when you were had a good, strong relationship with God? No, in my case, it was a time when I was being rebellious or mad about something or angry about something, and I wasn't listening to God and I wasn't doing what God wanted me to do. And so what did he do? He started taking away the peace, and he started taking away the prosperity, and things started falling apart. I remember one time, you know, we were living up north, and it was a time things were rough at the post office, and I wasn't enjoying my job, and I wanted to do one thing, God wanted me to do another, and I was kind of pushing back and trying to have it my way. Okay, and then a lightning bolt hit my wellhead and just melted my submersible pump. Well, that wasn't near the problem up there that it is down here, because down here you got a 400-foot well. Up there I had a 42-foot well. So they just pulled up a couple pieces of pipe, screwed new pipe on. And the insurance paid for it. It only cost me $100. And we were only without water for about 2 days. But we had 2 babies, and so it was not a good time to be without water. And so we got it all fixed again, and I just kind of persisted on having my own way and pushing it my way and demanding, you know, praying to God about the situation, but only praying that he would fix it the way I wanted him to fix it. Okay. And so it just went on and went on. Well, when they put the new pump in, they said, this pump has a 1 billion volts resistor in it. Said you'll never have to replace it again. 1 billion volts. And by the end of the summer, I was still this mess and still pushing against God, and lightning struck my wellhead and melted that pump down to nothing. And I'm standing out there looking at it, and I remember I looked up to God and I said, okay, your way. And they come and replace the pump again, and lightning never hit it after that. And I really know in my heart that I caused God to have to get my attention twice. Now, you didn't know I was very stubborn.
No idea.
See you next week.
We've talked to Janice, so we know you.
Okay, for you guys that weren't here, the menu is going to be Spanish beans with Spanish spices and Spanish meat. It's going to be Spanish rice. We're going to have shrimp and fish tacos, and we're going to have a couple, 3 kinds of salsa. It's on 2/22. So I need to know if that's a bad day and we need to change the date, and I need to know who are you going to be bringing with you. Bring anybody you want. But let me know how many's coming.